Well, welcome back to Elevate Online. I pray that the service has been a blessing to you so far and that your heart's been stirred and challenged to focus on the greatness of God and who He is. Well, last week we finished our first section of this great Gospel of Matthew, and the King has arrived and He's ushering in His kingdom. And will you heed the call to join the kingdom? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Jesus' public ministry launches with a bang. People are coming to see and hear Jesus from all over. They have never seen someone such as this in their lifetime. Yes, many knew about John the Baptist. Many had heard him preach. Many had even been baptized by him. But this man, Jesus, wasn't like anyone else they had ever seen or met. They heard stories about Elisha and Elijah, but Jesus was even greater than them. Mark chapter 1, verse 22, and they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Luke 4, verse 32, and they were astonished at his teaching, for his word was with authority. People from all over the area known as Palestine and beyond had come to follow Jesus. Matthew 4, verse 25, great multitudes followed him from Galilee and from the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond Jordan. And now with their eyes set squarely on him, Jesus delivers one of the greatest sermon series ever preached. Matthew chapter 5, beginning of verse 1, and seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them. Jesus sees this mass of people who have come from just about everywhere. And he gets real with them, particularly those who have fully committed to following him and pursuing a kingdom life. For note that Jesus only began to teach after his disciples had come to him. Through this series of series, Jesus presents to them and to us what we're going to call the principles of the kingdom. He sits down with them and says, right, you want to follow me? That's wonderful. You want to have a part in the kingdom? That's great. But this is what it means and looks like to be part of the kingdom of heaven. As we come to see, to live a kingdom life means being governed by a different wisdom, better wisdom, higher wisdom, heavenly wisdom. It means being governed by that wisdom James describes as coming from above. In fact, many have said that the book of James is simply a series of applications drawn from the principles outlined in the Sermon on the Mount. James chapter 3, verse 17, that wisdom that is from above. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. And now as we begin to explore this incredible sermon series, we come to our first principle. And this principle is outlined in a very familiar passage. A passage that Matthew Ewers has been brilliantly expounding upon. And as we delve into this first principle, I do not wish to override anything that Matthew has shared, for he has done a fantastic job addressing each one of these characteristics listed in these verses. And I'm looking forward to hearing his continuing series on the Beatitudes. So to avoid restating or contradicting Matthew, we are going to try and grasp the overall challenge and message Jesus is trying to convey. And this first principle Jesus lays out for those who want to join in the kingdom and follow the King and be a part of the kingdom of heaven is the principle of humility. Kingdom life is a life of humiliation. It is the way of the old rugged cross. Mark 8, verse 34, when he had called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. A kingdom life is a humble life. And as you read through each of these attitudes, you find that they point to one consistent theme. They call you to set aside yourself and what matters to you here for the blessings and rewards that are to come from above. Matthew chapter 5, verse 12, what does Jesus tell them at the end of this first section? Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. J. Oswald Sanders, in his book Shoe Leather Commitment, wrote while defining the ideal disciple by the Beatitudes that many think that if they have an abundant wealth, if they have absence of sorrow and suffering, good health, a good job, unrestricted gratification of appetites, and a kind treatment from everyone, that would be blessedness indeed. But Jesus completely reversed that concept and substituted many of the experiences we would like to sidestep. Poverty, mourning, hunger, thirst, renunciation, persecution. But true blessedness, Oswald writes, is found along this path, he told them. The rewards of the kingdom are found along the path of humility. These blessings come by the pursuit of the way of the old rugged cross. Charles Spurgeon is attributed to saying, "Hide not the offense of the cross, lest you make it of none effect. The angels and corners of the gospel are its strength. To pare them off is to deprive it of its power. Toning it down is not an increase of strength, but the death of it." And now as we take a stroll through this familiar passage and look through these various attitudes, we learn that the principle of humility, this aspect of humility in our lives, begins in the heart. It's rooted in the heart. Humility is rooted in the heart. Look at verse 3. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." Drawing from Oswald Sanders again, he calls these first four attitudes passive personal qualities. They deal with that inner man. They focus heavily upon the attitude of the heart. A heart that acknowledges its inadequacy, is broken before God, lets go of its demands, and craves only that which is of God will result in humility. You see, this kind of heart has caught a glimpse of the glory and awesomeness of God and has come to terms with how despicable it is when compared to such majesty. What was Isaiah's response after his vision of God and all of his holiness? Isaiah 6 verse 5, "So I said, woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." This kind of heart accepts and acknowledges that anything good in this life is only because of God. James 1 verse 17, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning." Therefore, this heart lives and does its life in the realm of God's sufficient grace. 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9, "And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." On one occasion, Samuel Brangle, the revered longtime leader of the Salvation Army, was introduced as the great Dr. Brangle. And in his diary he wrote that night, "If I appear great in their eyes, the Lord is most graciously helping me to see how absolutely nothing I am without Him, and helping me to keep little in my own eyes. He does use me, but I am so concerned that He uses me, and that it is not of me the work is done. The axe cannot boast of the trees it has cut down. It could do nothing but for the woodsman. He made it, He sharpened it, and He used it. And the moment He throws it aside," Brangle writes, "it becomes only old iron. Oh, that I may never lose sight of this." The man or woman who find their worth in the work of God alone will be a humble person. In his book, Your Father Loves You, James Packer writes that humility and a passion for praise are a pair of characteristics which together indicate growth in grace. The Bible is full of self-humiliating, the man bowing before God, and doxology, man giving praise to God. The healthy heart is one that bows down in humility and rises in praise and adoration. The Psalms strike both these notes again and again. So too Paul, and his letters both to articulates humility and breaks into doxology. Look at look at his three descriptions of himself, dating respectively from AD 59, 63, and 64. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 9, for I am the least of the apostles, whom not worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 8, to me, who am less than the least of all the saints, this grace was given, that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, this is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. Packer goes on to write that as the years pass, Paul goes lower. He grows downward. And as his self-esteem sinks, so his rapture of praise and adoration for God, for the God who so wondrously saved him, rises. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 17. After Paul says, of whom I am chief, the chiefest of sinners. What does he write? Now to the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, to God who alone is wise, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. Humility is rooted in the heart. For humility comes from a heart that accepts that it is what it is because of God's amazing grace. It sounds a cry that someone once shared, there but for the grace of God I go I. Romans chapter 12, verse 3, for I say through the grace given to me, to every one who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. Yet as we continue to explore this passage, we learn not only the key to humility, but the action of humility. For you see, humility is rooted in the heart. But humility is also expressed in life. Humility is rooted in the heart, but also expressed in life. Look at verse 7 of Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Then he gets personal. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Going back to Oswald Sanders, he classifies these attitudes as active social qualities. And with the mindset of living in grace, their heart attitude will be displayed by how we act and react in our society. How we respond to others and deal with the challenges and struggles of life. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 10, but by the grace of God I am what I am. And his grace toward me was not in vain, but I labored more abundantly than they all. Yet not I, but the grace of God which was with me. Living in the realm of God's grace motivated Paul to live out that grace in the world around him. His primary concern was for the souls and lives of others, not his own comforts and status. Philippians chapter 1, verses 24 and 25. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. And being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy of faith. The action of humility is placing the priority on the cares of others over the cares of oneself. Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Let nothing be done through strife or through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. A Christian news / magazine article shared the recollection of one of its contributors And in this article, the contributor wrote that one Sunday afternoon, her family had gathered around their large big oak table for dinner. And soon her daughter's laughter rose above the talk. And she said, "Graham, you're silly." And they all turned to see the contributor's mom delicately lifting to her mouth a small strand of peas on the blade of her knife. And all but one pea made it, and everyone clapped. And then the mother/grandmother told the story behind her unorthodox technique. She went on to say, "When I was little, we didn't have much. It was the Depression, but we did have a table full of food because my father grew wonderful vegetables. Lots of hobos who had jumped from the train wandered onto our property looking for a real meal. And more than often than not, an extra seat was pulled up to our table for dinner. One summer afternoon, I was sweeping the kitchen floor when my father's voice came through the screen. 'Lizzie, set another plate. We have company tonight.' Our guest paused in the doorway and dipped his head in a gesture of gratitude. 'Looks like he doesn't speak much English,' Dad said, 'but he's hungry like we are, and his name is Henry.' And when dinner was ready, Henry stood until we were all seated, then gently perched on the edge of his chair, his head bowed and his hat on his lap. And the blessings were said and dishes were passed from hand to hand. And we all waited, as was proper, for our guest to take that first bite. Henry must have been so hungry because he didn't notice us watching him as he grabbed his knife. Carefully, he slid the blade into the pile of peas before him and then lifted a quivering row of it to his mouth without spilling a single pea. He was eating with his knife. I looked at my sister May, and we covered our mouths to muffle our snickers, and Henry took another knifeful and then another. My father, taking note of the glances we were exchanging, firmly set his fork down. He looked me in the eye. Then he took his knife and thrust it into the peas on his plate. Most of them fell off as he attempted to lift them to his mouth, but he continued until all the peas were gone. Dad never did use his fork that evening because Henry didn't. It was one of my father's silent lessons in acceptance. He understood the need for this man to maintain his dignity, to feel comfortable in a strange place with people of different customs. Even at my young age, I understood the greatness of my father's simple act of brotherhood. And as the grandmother finished her story, she paused, she looked at the grandchildren and winked as she plowed her knife into the mountain of peas. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8. And above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Humility is displayed by our compassion, our honesty, our pursuit of reconciliation, and our all-around blamelessness of life. The Prince of Humility is a bedrock to a life that follows the King and lives in his kingdom. Matthew 18 and verse 4, therefore whoever humbles himself as his little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. To follow the King and to live in the kingdom will mean setting aside of oneself, and it will mean setting aside what matters to you here for the blessings and rewards that come from above. Proverbs 22 and verse 4, by humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. Isaiah 57 verse 15, for thus says the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place with him who has a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite ones. The King did not pull any punches with what it means to be a citizen of the kingdom. To live in the kingdom and to be a follower of the King means you're walking the way of the old rugged cross. To the old rugged cross I will ever be true. Its shame and reproach gladly bear. The cross was never meant to be a fashion symbol. The cross was meant to be a message of humiliation. Therefore, it is an offense and a stumbling block to many, yet it is still the hallmark of the kingdom life. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 23 and 24. But we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So as the King begins this series of series, he asks all those who say they are going to follow him and have a part in the kingdom, will you walk the way of the cross? Will you commit to the principle of humility? And then goes on to say, it is more than likely it will not bring you great reward here. But do not fret, for great is your reward to come. Romans chapter 8, verse 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. In his book Uncomfortable, Brett McCracken expresses at the conclusion on his chapter titled The Uncomfortable Cross, that this is the trajectory of the Christian life. Like Christ, we descend to ascend. We humble ourselves, shunning our status, accepting the depths of depravity. And then we are exalted with Christ. After suffering glory, after the cross resurrection, every loss is worth the gain in Christ. So as we enter this series of series, our theme continues. And we call you to join in following the King. Come, partake of the kingdom life. Pursue the principle of humility.